Bojo and Dinawe Maganidag, Zagate Kwe and Dijnakas, Biju and Odem, Abading, Mede Kwe and Dao, Chigasna Pi and Donjaba, Meiti Anishinaabe Kwe and Dao. My spirit name, the way that it was told to me by my Guime, my namer, is when the sky is overcast with clouds, but in a few spots the sun's rays start shining down. If you look in an Ojibwe dictionary, it will say the sun is coming out or shining. I'm from the Lynx clan. I'm Métis from the Red River region, like Alana mentioned. Yesterday, my talk focused more on my own personal spiritual journey and some detail about the Midewiwin, which I find particularly helpful in my life. Today I'll share a little bit about my journey today as well, but I'll focus much more on my research question, some oral history surrounding Métis relationships with Anishinaabe spirituality and identity, and I'll share a bit about the colonial context, our relationship with Christianity especially, and some pieces of legislation that have really impacted the way Métis people identify and the way our relationships with spirituality have formed, as well as get into some of my research design and findings. On my dad's side, our ancestors come from France. They started coming over in the 1600s to Quebec and then to Manitoba. My father's family is Roman Catholic, very heavily involved. He's part of the Knights of Columbus. He was the Grand Knight for a while. My mother is Métis from a Métis community called St. Laurent, Manitoba, also a Catholic community. We've had Métis ancestry for 7 generations, dating all the way back to the birth of the Métis Nation in the Plains. One of my ancestors' names is Bostonette Hangman Jr. He was actually involved in the Battle of Seven Oaks. I don't know if you are familiar with that. I can touch upon that a little bit more shortly. So I was raised Catholic, which is not uncommon for Red River Métis people especially. I was baptized, I was an altar girl, I sang in the choir, I did First Communion, Reconciliation, Confirmation, the whole 9 yards. And this right here is a photo of my confirmation. Shortly after that photo was taken, though, I started developing questions that I felt Roman Catholicism I wasn't satisfied with the answers that I was getting. And so shortly after this photo, I actually walked away from the church and began searching. I dabbled in one of the Anishinaabe stages of life called the fast life. This is where you're trying to learn who you are and you're engaging in self-destructive behavior and activity. So things like alcohol. I was also exploring different faiths like feminist Christianity, feminist Judaism, Wicca, Buddhism, yoga, but nothing quite felt right until I actually came here for my master's, University of Toronto. I had my first prof who self-identified as Métis. She was very instrumental in shaping my relationship with Anishinaabe spirituality. She brought me to my first sweat, full moon ceremony, women's drum circle. And then I continued in that way when I went to Trent University for my PhD. I there had access to Midewiwin elders for the first time, and I started taking Anishinaabemowin classes and began the journey of doing family history research and genealogy and learning about myself as Métis Anishinaabe. After that, I wanted to make these kinds of connections in the Red River area where I'm from. So I have since developed familial relationships with people from different reserves and Métis communities back where I'm from. I'm blessed to have several teachers guiding me. I also began my own initiation walk as Midewiwin a few years ago and initiated as First Degree Midewiwin, which is an ancient spiritual society among the Anishinaabe. And while I was going to ceremonies, I noticed, where are the other Métis people? It would be really nice if there were people from the older generations that could be my role models, and I was having a hard time finding where the other Métis people are. So that kind of led me to my research questions, which are: what experiences and factors lead some people with Métis ancestry to choose to follow Anishinaabe spirituality? And in what ways does following such a spiritual path influence self-identity? Doing some digging in terms of oral history and what's available, what kinds of stories have been passed down about Métis relationships with Anishinaabe spirituality is hard to do because of the effects of colonization. So especially after the failed resistance on the plains in 1885, when it became dangerous to be Métis, we were labeled traitors and rebels. Any of our First Nation relatives that were helping us out during those battles were blacklisted. Their rations were cut to their reserves. So a lot of this information went underground, and a lot of families became very quiet about being Métis, especially those of us with fair skin. If we could pass as white, then we would. Some people changed their last names to something more French Canadian, or another aspect of their ancestry that denied their Aboriginality. However, I was told by the Grand Chief of the Three Fires Midewin, Eddie Benton Benet, Bodwaywood Benesi is his true name, that when Louis Riel, famed Métis leader, was in exile in the States, he was actually adopted by a Midewin family in the States and became Midewin himself. So that blew me away. I mean, Louis Riel is known for being a very religious man, especially Roman Catholic. And I think I wonder what it would do if more people knew about these kinds of stories. In terms of literature, again, because of the effects of colonization, it's very difficult to find anything published on Métis relationships with Anishinaabe spirituality. I've been able to find two that actually focus on this topic. One of them is Elmer Ghostkeeper's Spirit Gifting. It's a short book that stems from his master's research. And in it, one of the chapters talks about Métis worldview. And in his particular experience, that stems from a Cree Métis perspective. So that's helpful. Although it plays a small role in his book as a whole. The second book that I found helpful in this area is by Prefontaine, Paquin, and Young, and it's called Métis Spiritualism. It's actually a short chapter that was developed for the Gabriel Dumont Institute, and it's available online. Again, in this one, there's a short section that talks about what they call, well, first of all, they say it's nearly impossible to define a Métis spirituality because our spiritual practices and faiths exist on a continuum from like complete Anishinaabe spirituality or Nehiawewin Cree spirituality to complete, let's say, Roman Catholicism. There's a lot of syncretism and blending of these throughout. So this exists on a continuum. And the rest of their piece deals more with the Christianization of the Métis. And that's what the majority of the literature will talk about, the Christianization. Within that, you can glean pieces of information about like evidence of our relationship going to ceremony, for example, during like the early fur trade days. But again, overall, very hard to find this kind of information. Also, looking into the literature, I found it helpful to look at identity strategies, especially as Métis people, our identity almost went underground after 1885. So some of these really impact us to this day. I already mentioned the concept of passing, so trying to pass as the the more dominant aspect of your own identity and downplaying or completely denying your minority aspect. So not correcting people if they assume you're Spanish, for example. People that I interviewed as part of my research, this was one of the common themes that came up. Also, a legacy of silence. Even to this day, within my family, I have a great aunt who says, I am French Canadian. That's it. You know, even though she has all of the, or a lot of the identifying iconic Métis cultural characteristics, she speaks Michif. My mother's family speaks Michif. They didn't pass it on to the younger generations, which is unfortunate. But again, part of this legacy of silence. And we don't know our own family history. You know, what I shared earlier about my ancestor Boston Pangman, that, like, he was one of the first to get arrested after the first governor of the Red River Colony made up a law saying you can't take pemmican out of the colony for a year, and you can't hunt buffalo on horseback, which of course was Métis' main livelihood. So we resisted, and my ancestor was one of the first to get arrested. There was backlash to that, though, and they couldn't enforce it. So nothing really came of it except for a building resentment that led to the Battle of Seven Oaks. So having an ancestor participate in one of the key factors that led to Métis nationhood, you think would be something to celebrate, that you would teach your kids, that they grow up being proud of this. But nobody in my family knew this. I had to dig in the archives and do research. I'm the one that traced our family history research. So I'm able now to share these things with the older people, with the rest of my family. So this is another aspect of the effects of colonization. Something else that you may have come across in Indigenous identity is this concept of policing and a hierarchy of nativeness. So this thought that there's a hierarchy of what's a real Indian. And there's a hierarchy. So do you live on a reserve? Do you have registered Indian status? Can you speak the language? Are you Christian? Are you from an urban area? These are all hierarchized. And you might hear someone say, oh, that person is just a Bill C-31 Indian. You know, they only have that. Forgetting that this whole process of status was created by the government in the first place. Unfortunately, these kinds of policing each other's identities is very much apparent in many of our communities and circles today. Finally, an identity strategy that I found really relates to what I am hearing the participants in my study talk about is this concept of retraditionalization. So instead of using the Indian Act and status to create our identity categories, we are turning to more traditional forms of identity, things like genealogy, kinship, relationship to communities, adoption, these kinds of things as a way of kind of reclaiming our self-determination. Something else that we can't gloss over when looking at the Métis is the definition of Métis, which is notoriously complex and difficult to define, again, as a result of colonization. So who is included and who is excluded has changed over the years. Many scholars talk about the Great Lakes proto-Métis. So the seeds for Métis nationhood were sown in the Great Lakes, but didn't arise until the plains, the buffalo culture of the plains, and the Battle of Seven Oaks, the Sayre trial, the resistance that led to the creation of Manitoba. Those are key aspects that solidify Métis nationhood. And then legislation that has impacted our identity. So again, the Indian Act creating the category of status Indian, of course, excluded a bunch of people who then the government started calling Métis. We actually had kinship relationships with these non-status Indians from the prairie regions, many of us intermarried and they started calling themselves Métis and were accepted as Métis. And then again with the Constitution Act of 1982 with Section 35 and the three Aboriginal groups in Canada, First Nation, Métis, and Inuit. Again, there are non-status Indians that are excluded and looking for a recognition from the federal government, and so begin calling themselves Métis. This changes the membership of the Métis, and not everybody is happy about that. So these are some of the reasons why discussing who are you including when you talk about Métis is so complex and a very sensitive subject. Looking at the way that Christianity has impacted Métis relationships with Anishinaabe spirituality, we have to take a look at the Christianization of the Métis. So we can compare, I found it useful to compare Métis experiences in the Red River and Plains regions with the Métis in the northern states. So large M with an accent, Red River Métis experiences compared to small m, no accent, Métis. And you can find evidence in the archaeological record, the anthropological record about, or looking in the diaries and journals of priests even, about Métis people who were participating in ceremony. So you'll read passages in priests' journals saying it's so upsetting that these half-breeds and Métis claim that they're Catholic and Christian one minute, and then the next weekend they're practicing La Grande Médecine. So that was what they called the Médéouen specifically. So you have to dig for it, but you'll find evidence like that across our experiences. But more and more those experiences get silenced with just the overwhelming pursuits of the missionaries. So in Red River specifically, the priests used to come on the buffalo hunt with us. They called these missions ambulantes, or mobile missions. The priest would winter with us, follow us along the prairies as we hunted buffalo. They would preach to our kids during the day and to our adults over the fire, the dinner fire at nighttime. So we have a very long history of this relationship with Roman Catholicism specifically. By 1818, we had a permanent missionary in what would become St. Boniface, Manitoba, which happens to be my backyard today. And schools were instituted with the purpose of specifically teaching Métis people the ways of Christianity. And many of us, especially Red River, really adopted these in syncretic fashions. So we blended them with teachings that we would receive from our maternal Aboriginal communities. Unfortunately, the connections that we had with our maternal Anishinaabe, Nehiyawewen spiritualities diminish as colonization proceeds. There's a whole whack of other pieces of legislation that have really impacted our spirituality and the way that we self-identify, in addition to things like the Indian Act and the more contemporary amendments to the Indian Act, Bill C-31 and Bill C-3. There's also the treaty-making era. The numbered treaties did a lot to externalize the Métis, especially Red River Métis, from participating in treaty making. So the treaty commissioners had instructions from their superiors to only deal with the Indians. According to them, half-breeds and Métis were white, of course because of the goal of assimilation. They figured they don't need these half-breeds and Indians don't need as much civilization help as the Indians, so we'll focus our efforts on the Indians. But of course, if you read about these scrip commissions, they had a hard time distinguishing between Métis and half-breeds and our First Nations relatives. So a table would be set up with three white commissioners, and we would stand in a line and they would judge what we are. You know, you're Métis, you're Indian, you can have this, you can have that. We were allowed to make the choice between treaty and scrip sometimes, but more and more this was discouraged among the Métis, and we were encouraged to take scrip. So the scrip system, I'm not sure if people are familiar with that. After Louis Riel and the provisional government helped create the province of Manitoba in 1870, there's a section in that promises 1.4 million acres of land to the Métis. Nowhere in the Manitoba Act does it actually talk about the scrip system. However, the government came up with this lottery-type scrip system as a way of distributing the land. Unfortunately, it was horrendously corrupt, and something like only 15% of original applicants actually got their land or money, usually 160 acres or 240, or the equivalent in dollars. For example, in my family history research, I have about 24 photocopies of scrip, which means that 24 of my ancestors were supposed to receive 160 or 240 acres of land or money, and we have no land. We don't even have memory of what happened to this land. That's how powerful the legacy of silence is. And that's not my family is not unique in this. This is a common experience among Métis in the Plains. So by the government saying, you're Indian, you're Métis or half-breed, you are completely different, it messed with our own conceptions of our familiality, our relationships with our First Nation cousins, and kind of created and solidified these divisions between Métis and First Nation that are still, I argue, visible today within our communities. There are also colonial systems, larger systems, like the residential school system, that have deeply impacted the way Métis self-identify and our relationships with spirituality. I mentioned by 1818, there was a permanent mission in Red River. So Métis relationships with what would become the residential school system are complicated. More and more people are learning about residential schools these days, but not everybody knows about the differences between residential school and day school. So where in the day school, the children were able to go home afterwards. But the same priests and nuns taught at both schools. The same curriculum was offered in both. And of course, Métis and half-breed individuals were accepted into residential schools sometimes as well. The government changed their criteria for accepting these types of individuals almost at a whim. Factors that influenced that were the per capita system. So more bums in seats equals more dollars. So if we don't have enough Indians, well, we'll let in the half-breeds. And if we have too many students, the half-breeds are the first to go. Or we're going to put the half-breeds and Métis to work sewing the school outfits, tending the garden that feeds the children, as opposed to learning the curriculum. So in this sense, we also experienced Métis-specific discrimination at the schools and even beyond the schools, because of course with the Indian residential school settlement, perhaps the majority of Métis are excluded from compensation because the day schools don't appear on the official list of residential schools as part of that settlement. So many of us feel that our experiences, it's hard for us to heal if we don't have acknowledgement that we also suffer the intergenerational effects from these schools. And then moving from that almost seamlessly into the child welfare system, where again the government is taking our children from our homes and placing them usually in white homes where they supposedly would receive better care and education. Métis also participated in this colonial system, and we are suffering the same intergenerational effects from these systems, which are similar to the ones from the residential school, including loss of identity, culture, loss of relationship with our family, which messes with our identity and we walk around feeling lost, and mental health issues, addictions issues, all these types of things. Unfortunately, there are more children in care now than at the height of the residential schools about the 1940s. So we still have much work to do in this regard. Looking at the pieces I could find from oral history and the literature and the colonial context of these systems like the Indian Act legislation and residential and 60s scoop, I fashioned a research design that I call a Métis Anishinaabe research design. The heart of it is Anishinaabe, from teachings that I've learned in as Medeoan in the Three Fires Medeoan Lodge, also from other lodges and teachings, blended with specific Western research tools. So the way my worldview, my relationship to reality, or in other words, ontology, is informed by these specific concepts. The Anishinaabe creation story, which unfortunately I don't have time to get into each of these, but especially the part about how humans were created literally from the earth, which is why we say we come from our mother, the earth. And the four original groups of people, the red, the black, the white, and the yellow, and how Creator gave each of these groups specific instructions, original instructions for how to live life in a good way to attain this other concept here, Minoba Mataziwin, which means a healthy, good, balanced life. Also, the Nijwaswe Ishkode Khan, the Seven Fires prophecy, is another teaching that really resonates with me. Essentially, there was a time when seven prophets visited the people and foretold of coming eras in time and what to expect. This triggered a great migration of the Anishinaabe and is the reason why we are distributed throughout North America in the way that we are. Specifically, in the time, basically it says that we will lose our way. We will lose the Medeoan teachings, and they will be replaced by the coming of the light-skinned race and their teachings. This is a super truncated version. If you want to learn more about these kinds of things, I highly suggest reading Eddie Benton Benet's The Mishomis book. But it says that after a time of great suffering where we will have lost our way, in the time of the seventh fire, a new people, the Oshkebemadazi, will be born to retrace the steps of our ancestors and find those things that were left for us. So the language, sweat lodge, teachings. And if we would remain strong in our task, we could light the eighth fire, which is an eternal fire of unity, brotherhood, sisterhood. And this other concept here, Miskasoin, and which means journeying to the center of oneself to learn about oneself. I find it relates to another concept. This one's Cree. The Ojibwe one is Mikwain Dasoin, which means something to the effect of recalling our past and remembering where we came from, including our origins. So together, these form my worldview and how I approach research, how I approach participants, and also my life's work, which is helping other Métis reconnect with Anishinaabe and Nehiyawewan spiritualities. In a similar way, my relationship to knowledge is influenced by key Anishinaabe concepts. So this first one here, think Anishinaabe, or I could have written think Medeoan. So every decision that I make every day in my life, I'm supposed to do it from my heart as Medeoan. And that includes how I approach research, how I approach participants. Also privileging Anishinaabe sources of knowledge that come in the form of dreams, ceremony, knowledge that comes from teachings, and a responsibility to act on these teachings that are shared. You can't just get a teaching and do nothing with it. Once you receive a teaching, then becomes your lifelong responsibility to develop a relationship with it and ensure its existence and share it. So in these ways, to begin my research project, I actually fasted in the community of Hollow Water First Nation in Manitoba and asked for help, guidance from Spirit to figure out this topic. This was another way that I got to this topic overall. I did have a dream there. I talk more about this in my upcoming book, but that dream further solidified what I believe my life's work would be, as well as approaching this project. My relationship to ethics, again, centered on Métis Anishinaabe perspectives, like the centrality of relationships, relational accountability, and benefiting the greater good. So there's a really helpful piece written by Herman Mitchell where he talks about when you take something from nature, nature becomes imbalanced. And the same thing happens when you do research. If you interview somebody and you take some knowledge from them, you've created an imbalance. So it becomes up to you to rebalance. The way that I dealt with that was with the use of sacred medicines. So I offered a tobacco tie to each of the participants. That's how I approached them to ask if they'd like to participate. I also had smudge. We smudged before the interview, and it was there in case we needed to relight the smudge during the interviews. And then again, to say, miigwech, thank you for participating. I handpicked women's sage, and I sewed cloth drawstring bags to say thank you for participating, and then they can use that medicine in their lives. And then in terms of methodology, how I approached the methods specifically, the criteria for participation for participating in the study included having Métis ancestry, specifically from the Manitoba region, being born off reserve and without status, and having committed to Anishinaabe spirituality. I left the definition of Anishinaabe spirituality up to the participants themselves. I didn't want to limit that. And also, I didn't create a specific definition for the term Métis because I found the participants' identities were so complex that it was hard not to reproduce like Indian Act categories and things like that. I talk much more about that in the book and how that plays out. I used quota sampling and conducted semi-structured interviews, and then to analyze the data from the interviews, I used thematic coding as well as what I call prayerful and intuitive analysis. So I paid specific attention to my dreams. As Medeouan, I'm encouraged to begin every day by putting down tobacco and starting my day with prayer. So I did that, I do that every day. And with particular mindfulness for the project, throughout the project's life, I also would smudge myself before analyzing the data, or if I became overwhelmed or discouraged, I would relight the smudge, I'd smudge my computer. And I also made sure to have a close contact with my spiritual teachers, especially third degree Midekwe Rainy Gawish from Manitoba area, in helping to make sure that I remain accountable to the participants and the work. In addition to this, I looked for common themes in the work. The participants themselves, there were 18, ranging in age from 25 to 76 at the time of interview. There were an equal number with and without status. Their Aboriginal ancestry, for the most part, was either Anishinaabe, Cree, and or Métis. And then for the European ancestry was, for the most part, French, Scottish, English, and or Irish. In terms, let me get my notes here. In terms of residence patterns, just like broader residence patterns among Aboriginal people today, A majority of the participants themselves have been moving from rural to urban locations. So most of them are now living in cities. None of them were born on a reserve or raised solely on a reserve, but a couple of the participants today are living on a reserve. A few were born in Métis-specific communities. Half were raised in one, but none are living in Métis-specific communities today. Like I said, most of them are moving to urban areas. In terms of employment, they range from the education field, justice, human resources, social work, and 2 were unemployed. And the people that I ended up speaking with overall as a group were quite highly educated. Most had a certificate or diploma or a degree. About 3 of them, at least, also had a doctorate. So this might have to do with my own contacts, and my one of my advisors was Mide Kwe Rainey-Gawish, and so our circles led to these kind of researcher-driven participants. There's 3 main areas that I looked at overall: family history, self-identification, and relationship with Anishinaabe spirituality. In terms of family history, I asked, growing up, what was your family's relationship with Aboriginal culture? And depending on how they responded, certain patterns arose. For example, a pattern around language. So while most of the participants have older family members that can speak an Indigenous language, most of the participants themselves cannot. On the bright side, at least 7 of them are taking language classes today and are committed to relearning their languages. Values was another important area that arose. People talked about things like importance of family and kinship, importance of intergenerational transmission of cultural knowledge. So things like, I already mentioned language, child rearing, traditional knowledge, even teachings on how to be a good man and provide for family. And another value being respect for elders. There were also cultural subsistence practices like relationships with land, harvesting berries, drying fish, picking specific medicines that people grew up doing, and things like hunting, fishing, trapping, harvesting, and the preparation of traditional foods. There were also activities mentioned like fiddling and jigging, the powwow circuit, drumming, singing. In terms of emotion with regards to relationship with Aboriginal culture while growing up, people talked about disassociation a lot, that we didn't talk about this much in our family. There was silence in our family, or to the point of my grandparents were ashamed and we were not allowed to talk about our relationship with Aboriginal culture. We could not call ourselves Métis. This is changing though with the younger generations. They're more open to having pride about their identity and reconnecting in ways. They also talked about this concept of kimuchli, which means secretively. So they might have, their parents or grandparents might have participated in Aboriginal culture in kind of quiet ways, under the radar, not directing attention to themselves. And also that these ways were lived and embedded, as opposed to talking openly and honestly about them. I also asked, what was your relationship growing up? What was your family's relationship growing up to Euro-Canadian cultures? And these are the patterns that came up: education, employment, this pattern of control. A lot of people talked about there were various times in their lives where they felt the presence of Euro-Canadian control, whether it be through government-imposed identification cards or laws against hunting, fishing, midwifery, not being able to name themselves, control over resources, being taken and forced into residential schools, or being taken as part of the 60s scoop with the child welfare system. On the other hand, another common pattern was this desire to fit in. So they witnessed among their families wanting to be accepted, not wanting to suffer further discrimination or oppression. Just don't draw attention to your identity. Just try to fit in, So not teaching the younger generations the language, things like that. Even going as far as viewing Euro-Canadian cultures as superior. So this internalized colonization where older family members believed that Euro-Canadian cultures were better than and should be strived towards, and just kind of leave Aboriginal cultures behind. Just under half talked about positive relationships, either community-specific relationships or specific Euro-Canadian individuals that really impacted their lives, gave them a chance, gave them a job, treated them fairly, stood up for them in an instance where they felt they were being discriminated against. In terms of whether this relationship has changed over time, majority of the participants said there is no change to this particular relationship in their lives, in their families' lives. I was also interested in growing up, what was your family's relationship with spirituality? And resoundingly across the board, every single participant mentioned Christianity, some denomination of Christianity. 15 out of 18 participants specified Roman Catholicism. In terms of relationship with Aboriginal spirituality, there were only a couple participants that said that their family participated in ceremony in some form while they were growing up. The majority did not. However, many identified specific spiritual practices that they remember from growing up. Things like the use of traditional medicines in their families. They remember their mother or a grandmother boiling down specific roots to make specific medicines while they were growing up, or making offerings, so before putting down some tobacco before going hunting or fishing, those kinds of practices. But they were more lived and not openly discussed. In terms of change over time, this particular aspect of their family's relationship, the influence of Christianity is lessening, and more room is being made within the families for Aboriginal spiritual practices. In terms of self-identification, families self-identified mainly as Métis and half-breed, and only a couple as Anishinaabe while the participants were growing up. Whereas today, most of these participants are actually self-identifying as Anishinaabe and Métis, and none as half-breed. That has fallen out of favor today. Both thinking about growing up and the participants' self-identity today, people talked about things like feeling that others are forcing an identity upon them, trying to pass as white, using multiple terms when self-identifying, and more are, or if their family denied Aboriginal ancestry growing up, or even if they denied Euro-Canadian ancestry while growing up, they are no longer in a state of denial today. People are more open about the complexity of their identities. Another thing that came up was that people are experiencing racism, and it is influencing their identity today. And their spiritual experiences, like learning your name and your clan, are really influencing the way the participants self-identify. The last major section that I asked about was specifically relationship with spirituality. I didn't actually ask about disconnection factors, but so many people brought them up that it became a noticeable pattern. People talked about things that were preventing them from relating with and developing relationships with Anishinaabe spirituality, especially Christianity and conversion in their family over time, experiences with residential and day schools, this division between Métis and First Nation that is a result of colonization. I mentioned with the Indian Act and treaties creating and solidifying these divisions between our families. And then also addictions, struggling with addictions personally or within their family, and that has inhibited developing relationships with Anishinaabe spirituality. On the other hand, there were many more connection factors that people identified. Ceremonies was, actually going to ceremonies was one of the biggest triggers for people reconnecting. Particularly impactful ones were Sweat Lodge. The first time people experienced being around a little boy water drum or a grandfather water drum, and those types of things. Also, key people and places, so having access to elders, and often specific reserves that have a strong traditional presence. Traveling to these places to participate in ceremony has been helpful for reconnecting. Something else that arose was that the political and spiritual movements around the 1960s Civil Rights Act, the American Indian Movement, the Red Power Movement, have greatly impacted the way, basically it created space for people to be proud of who they are, to start talking about being Indigenous and being proud of it, and also the creation of role models for younger generations to look up to. This has paved the way for reclaiming Indigenous identity and culture and spirituality. And also another pattern that arose was higher education. Through universities, people are getting access to elders. They're experiencing smudge for the first time. They have an opportunity to learn from cultural teachers. Some universities even have a sweat lodge on their campus. And this is also really impacting the way that we identify and reconnect. I also asked about what spirituality means to participants, and most people talked about the importance of giving back to the community. I received so much from my community. I want to make sure that what was there for me is available for others who are coming after me. Also, the importance of relationships and connection, knowing who I am through my spirit name, my clan, my connections to communities, and this sensation of finally finding what I've been looking for. Before that, there was this period of searching. But through reconnection in these ways, people are saying, I finally found what I'm looking for. This is what feels right. This is what I was searching for. Finally, in terms of broader patterns that are emerging from my research, it is very obvious that the historical colonial context is still weaving its way through the lives of Indigenous people today. It is still impacting the way Métis self-identify and our relationships with Christianity, with Indigenous spiritualities. Also, the importance of those civil rights movements were extremely important across the board for the older participants in the study. Every single one talked about how important these movements are, even to this day, in terms of creating space and pride and identity. And that something similar is happening for the younger ones. Again, across the board, every single one of the younger participants identified higher education. This is where I had access to my first women's drum circle, my first Métis self-identified prof. And then finally, people are having transformative experiences. Sometimes they're overwhelmingly difficult and negative. Things like contemplating suicide or mental health issues or addictions. And then on the other hand, sometimes they're overwhelmingly positive, like experiencing a sweat lodge for the first time. But either way, they're using these experiences to further fuel their self-identity as Métis, Anishinaabe, and their connection, their adherence, their commitment to Anishinaabe spirituality. My goals in looking at these particular topics have been, first and foremost, remember I talked about the 7 fires prophecy, and that in the 7th fire, the new people would emerge, the Oshkibema Dezig, and that their task would be difficult, but they would be the ones to pick up what was left for us by our ancestors so that we could reconnect and be proud of who we are again. This is my effort to participate in the work of the Oshkibema Dezig. All of the participants in this study are amazing role models, and my hope is that their words will reach others and inspire reconnection in these ways. I'm also hoping that by exposing the way that colonization legislation have created these divisions between First Nation and Métis people, that we could begin to heal them and remember that we're related and stop policing each other's identities and return to Anishinaabe and spiritual, traditional ways of identifying, as opposed to relying on, that person's just a Bill C-31 status Indian, you know? And my belief is that in doing this, we can participate in reclaiming our own self-determination. So, miigwech very much, everybody, for listening. Thank you.
We've got time for questions.
Yep.